Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Cover to Cover. I'm Joanne Joseph. Great to be back with you again. So this episode I've loosely termed Histories, and that's because I'm bringing you three different accounts of different types of histories, all of which are rooted in our country. The first one is this beautiful moving book, Walking Through Front Doors by Claudine Shiels, a personal history, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a moment. And that's followed by an interview with the author of this prize-winning novel, Scatterlings, which is written in the genre of historical fiction, combining a bit of mythology with it as well. Some interesting thoughts coming out here about part of South Africa's history. And then this tome by Kate Mosse, an author who is internationally known but loved by many South African readers. And she told me about the second book in a series of 4 and what its links are to South Africa. Let's kick off with this book by Claudine Shiels, Walking Through Front Doors. It is a childhood account of a horrible incident that happened when she and her sister were very young, growing up in the Western Cape. And of course, she shares that in a way that is both painful and triggering, but also leaves the book on a note of hope. Well, this was the conversation I had with her. I must warn you that parts of this conversation may be triggering for you, as it does involve childhood sexual abuse. But I asked Claudine about the one event that changed everything for her when her life went from that of a happy child to one of a child who was devastated.
Well, it was a Friday night in 1967. I was 3 weeks short of my 8th birthday. And to this day, I remain absolutely astounded that such a mundane pedestrian suggestion of just going to take a drive down to Muizenberg to look at the Christmas lights that were still hanging in early January could set in motion a chain of events that would take our small, loving, warm family lives from one track onto another track, to the extent that things would never, ever be the same again. My mum just said, let's go and look at the lights. It was a hot summer's evening. And on the way to Muizenberg, we had to cross a level crossing, and we had a bad car accident. We got hit by a train. And from that night onwards, though we miraculously all survived, nothing was ever the same again. My mum changed. I think she had what we would nowadays recognize as post-traumatic stress. But in those days, there was no such thing. I'd never heard of such a thing. And she, 6 months later, left the family. She just walked out, felt that she couldn't be there anymore. She'd met somebody else, and she left.
That moment signals your entire family's descent into chaos. Just tell me how drastically your life changed from that home of stability, that bastion of stability that you had known as a home, to a place where chaos essentially reigned.
Well, when my mother's leaving really broke my father. So in many ways, we lost my father as well, because he became depressed, morose, and then took to alcohol to ease his pain. And shortly after that, he met somebody and he got married. I mean, he got married again, I think it was less than a year after my mother had left. And we suddenly found ourselves with a stepmother who couldn't have been more different to our own mother. And the change in our home, from everything to what we wore, what we ate, how she ran the home, it was absolutely and completely different to what we had been used to with my own biological mother. Our home life deteriorated rapidly into one of partying, drinking, debauchery. She and her family, her brothers, her friends, they loved to party. And my father, who was a broken man, having just lost his wife, and not really knowing what to do with these 2 young girls, was happy just to hand everything over to her and allow her to have her way. So sadly, that was what we found ourselves. That was the life and the home we found ourselves living in as 2 small girls. Yeah.
And of course, Claudine, we know that created the breeding ground really for the sexual abuse that was to happen, to which you and your sister Lisa would fall prey within a matter of years.
Yeah. My stepmother then had full reign, and she could live and conduct and rule and reign in the home in the way that she really wanted to, without the prying eyes of our blood family. And that's when the abuse really started. And my father, as I say, he just kind of disappeared into alcohol, and appeared not to notice what was happening to us, and appeared not to really care. I think he was just so relieved to have somebody look after the children, so that he could go to work, and not have to worry about us. And the abuse was horrendous. I mean, it was physical, it was psychological, it was emotional, and eventually it became sexual.
And of course, your father's gun throughout this time is very ubiquitous in the book. Even when it's not there, it somehow is in the form of an undercurrent that terrifies you children. Just tell me, Claudine, how influential that gun was in terms of either giving you the courage or preventing you from having the courage of actually speaking out about the abuse that you were enduring at that time.
Yeah, very often that gun would come out, and he would threaten us with it, and he would threaten my stepmother with it, usually when he was drunk, usually after a weekend of partying. And, if something hadn't gone his way, if he was upset about something, he would go for his gun. And we just became used to trying to keep the peace and don't anger dad, just keep things smooth, don't complain about your lot in life, just be compliant, and then you'll be safe. It was just better to be quiet about it, because in those days, you got hanged for murder, and we were absolutely terrified. We were processing things through children's minds, not adults. And we just felt that my father would this would be a wonderful excuse for him to discharge that weapon, and he would shoot these men. And we felt that, well, then the police will take him away and they'll hang him for murder, and we won't have anybody. So it became better just to keep quiet. And that meant keeping quiet about everything that was going on in the family. If our stepmother was being abusive to us when my father was at work, which she often was, we got locked out of the house, we got fed with the dogs in the backyard, it was better just to keep quiet, because if you stirred my father's anger, we knew that that gun would come out.
In a situation like this, one of two things happens. Either siblings become close and share the pain that arises out of their abuse, or, as in the case of you and your sister, you tend to diverge. What actually happened there? What caused that divergence?
It became easier not to talk to one another, because we had so much pent-up anger, so much frustration, so much rage, which we couldn't take out or express towards those who deserved it. So we found that every time we saw each other, every time we spoke, this anger and this rage would erupt, and it just became easier to go our separate ways and live our separate lives. And then my sister contacted me after our father's funeral. Well, in fact, we saw each other at our father's funeral, and we hadn't seen each other for a long, long time. And she phoned me afterwards, and she said to me, why do we hate each other so much? She said, I saw you at the funeral, and I actually realized I really love you, and you were such fun at the after event. I saw you laughing and smiling. And she said, I realized I've lost my sister. And slowly we started to connect. And then we talked. We talked and we talked and we talked and we talked. We talked every day sometimes we phoned each other twice, 3, 4 times a day. And we spoke for hours. And then this thing came up, being able to lay charges when the Constitutional Court voted to overturn the prescription period. And I had to really examine at that stage what we were doing this for, why we were now going to lay charges 45 years later. And it could not possibly be for revenge. So I had to, and I wrestled with this for a very long time. And I had to hand it over in my mind to the legal system. The law needs to decide what happens to them, because if we go through this and they are found not guilty, or it doesn't go our way, or we don't feel that justice has been served, it's going to devastate and cripple us. So I had to say to myself, what am I actually doing this for? Because I could be badly let down by the law. And I came to the conclusion that I just want the chance to tell the truth. We were bullied into silence, as I've just said, for so long, that to be able to stand up in a court of law and to say, this is what happened to us. Now you can decide. You're the law, you're the magistrate, you're the judge, you're the legal people. You decide what needs to happen in this case. I don't make the law of the land. In my own heart, personally, I've forgiven them. I have to, because I can't drag this hatred and anger and revenge around with me all of my life. It's just too damaging for me. So I have forgiven them, but that's a personal matter of the heart. Justice is to do with the legal system and the law of the land. The legal system can decide.
Claudine, just a final question. I mean, everyone hopes that with a book that they put together, that there will be something that people out there can take away from it, something that could potentially change their lives, impact on their way of thinking or their way of seeing the world. Have you seen that? Have you seen evidence of that in the way your book has been received?
I feel really blessed that it's touched people in the way that it has. People have said to me that I tell the truth, but it's not a gloomy book. It brings hope. There's hope and redemption at the end of it. And that is kind of what I set out to do, because there is hope. People have also told me that my book has helped them to come to terms what happened to them many years ago, or to, finally face things that happened to them. And that's really sad, because it is sad that it is so prolific. The sexual abuse is just, it's everywhere and it's awful. But I'm really pleased to have been able to help people connect with what happened to them, and then either decide that they want to lay charges, or it's enough just to face it and accept it and to move on.
So that was my conversation with Claudine Shiels, and her book, Walking Through Front Doors, is available in exclusive books right now. I recommend that you get it. A painful read, but a very heartening one at the end of all of it. And you might want to keep track of her story, because it's still playing out in the Western Cape High Court as we speak. The next book I'm taking a look at, as promised, is Scatterlings. I had a fascinating conversation with the winner of the Denane 2020 Fiction Prize. And of course, Resoketswe Manenzhe, who is the author of this, also happens to be an engineering lecturer and a PhD student. So I asked her about the connection between one and the other. How does one go from being someone operating in that discipline to writing award-winning historical fiction? This was what she told me, and also made me feel just a little bit old.
It's very surreal for me right now, because I grew up seeing you on TV. So to have you talking to me, I'm not able to believe this. But anyway, I think my first love was science, but I later went on to boarding school. And when I was in boarding school, I was very vulnerable, and boarding school was very difficult for me. I didn't know, I was 12 years old. I didn't know how to deal with all of that. I was away from my family. Hormones were going haywire. So my life suddenly didn't make sense to me. And the only way that I could make sense of everything was to write poetry. Later on, I ventured into short stories, and much later on into longer forms. But I always had this love for science and for engineering. But I also discovered this other thing that helped me figure out how life worked, as a teenager. It's very cliche, but it really did help me. And that's how I got into literature. And, I fell deeper and deeper in love with literature. And that's, I suppose, how we end up with a book and engineering at the same time.
Yeah. I love that. There's nothing cliched about it at all. I think the melding of those two worlds is a beautiful thing. But it also reminds me that a lot of people, particularly people who operate in a very factual world with facts and figures and numbers, and they find it difficult. Some of them even look down upon historical fiction or any kind of fiction as a genre. How do you marry the two sides of yourself, this artistic side as well as the very factual, rational side? How do you marry them in a book where you're not only blending historical fiction and aspects of our past, but you're also looking at mythology, you're incorporating mythology quite substantially in the book?
Yeah, I think I found fiction a lot more freeing. we live in the real world, we live with history being there, and it's true, and we really can't change much of it, maybe how we tell it. But we live with all these rigid things. But fiction is so freeing because you can escape into something that, and especially as a writer, you can escape into something that you can mold, and you can decide where this thing goes and that person goes. So I found it a lot more freeing than, say, writing personal essays, because that's something I already know, and that's something that already, it's there's not much freedom in that. So I suppose that's the easiest answer I can give. But also, it's just, for me, it's also been a journey of, because I have a lot of issues with our education system, and a lot of things that I think I know now about our history, I learned much later after I'd left school. So for me, it's also just been a journey of discovering, how South Africa came to be the place that it is, how as a people we came to sort of interact the way that we do. So it's also just been a journey of discovery for me, but also of escape. I suppose there's a contradiction in there, but it just, those things make sense to me, and that's how I make sense of the world, I suppose.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I'm really interested in the period that you chose. You're looking at the 1920s, and Scatterlings is set in quite a beautiful area to start off with, the Cape Winelands. Tell me why you chose that period in particular. I'm curious to know, because it's a question I'm also going to put to Kate Mosse in my next interview, but I'm intrigued by what moves writers to pick one particular period in which to operate.
A lot of the things that we kind of all collectively know as South Africans, or that were taught in, say, HSS, it's all kind of in the same period. So a lot of the stuff starts around 1948, and then it sort of ends off, it peters out in like 1994. And it's almost as if there was colonialism, and then immediately colonialism was followed by apartheid, whereas there was this long period where a lot of the designing of apartheid happened. And that's how it was able to be so sustainable, because it took a lot of phases, and a lot of the laws that ended up holding South Africa hostage were actually not designed or implemented during, initially, say in the 1940s. It comes a lot sooner than that, and it's a lot more complex than simply saying. And I kind of try to tackle the Immorality Act. On the surface, it just looks like, oh, the apartheid government was so petty. They just didn't want black and white people, or black and Indian, or Indian and white, to be together. Whereas when you try to examine it, it's a lot deeper than that. So that's why I chose that period. I just found it interesting that we tend to focus, or at least history, as I've been taught about it, tends to focus on only certain periods, the 1940s up till 1994. It's like that's all South Africa is, for the most part. And then there's like a few times you can throw in, Shaka Zulu, but a lot of it goes ignored. And I was very interested in that, so that's why I chose it.
And it is a fascinating period. It's a painful story in some ways, but it's also, I'm amazed at how you've tackled the issue of how the private and the personal becomes political.
Yes. That was a huge thing for me, and that was a result of history being very rigid. So if it's already there, I can't change, say, landmark laws, and make these characters have this kind of happy life that I want them to have. So if I can't do that, then what can I do with their personal lives? What can I do with the very intimate experiences of their everyday lives? And that was one of the reasons that I chose to focus more on a character-driven story.
I'm also interested in your choices around the female characters, many of them really strong characters and deeply interesting characters as women, or girls, as the case may be. But you also place the burden of migration and displacement on them. And I was interested to know why you did that with your female characters in particular.
Thank you for asking that question. Because again, I can't speak for all of history, or all of literature, or all of historical literature. But what I've read so far, both in school and afterwards, tends to focus more on what men were doing, how, colonialism, apartheid, displacement affected men, and more specifically, how it affected Black men as they went from, say, rural places to the mines in Johannesburg. And I've always been interested in what were the women doing at the time? What were they? How were they surviving? Because this history doesn't happen with just half the population. What's the other half doing? So, a lot of them would have been domestic workers. A lot of them would have worked in the farms. A lot of them did have lives and agency. And although, a lot of the things in their lives constricted them, they did have separate lives from their husbands and their brothers and their fathers. And that's why you have Alisa, who's displaced in a different way from, say, Gloria and Josephina. So I was very interested in exploring what the women were doing at that time. So it was kind of my own way of answering, all these questions I had when I read other literature. Like, okay, I can see that this man had it hard. Like, he left his family, he had it hard, he was in the mine, he couldn't breathe properly, he probably died of TB. But what were the women doing? How did this affect them?
I think that's such an important perspective of history that we often forget about, Shoki. Just a last question about this prize. I mean, it seems to have been something that came to you very unexpectedly. Even though you wrote a great manuscript, you don't seem to have expected to have won this Dinane Prize last year at all. And yet it's clear why the adjudicators thought you deserved this prize when one reads this book.
Oh, thank you.
Changed your life, your perspectives, your goals for the future?
Yeah, I had actually officially retired as a writer because
Are you not a little young to be retiring?
I was like, because as a writer, you get so many rejections. Like if I showed you my spreadsheet of all the places I've submitted to, it's mostly red, and that's how I code my rejections. And then the orange is like, okay, they tell you, oh, it was good, but it just wasn't what we were looking for at this time, submit at another time. And then the green is so few, and those are the acceptances. I retired. I was like, I'm done with this, it's too much. So, and then winning the prize did bring me out of retirement. So it was a very huge change.
That's what it was supposed to do, clearly.
Yes, it was a very huge change. And at one point there was a book sale for my publisher. And then I walked there expecting to be completely anonymous because my book hadn't even been published at the time. And Shay, she just points to me and she's like, she won an award. Her book is getting published. And like this group of people at Baxter Theatre, like a whole crowd of people were clapping and looking at it. It was very surreal. And I thought, oh no, I don't want this. This is too much attention. But and people just reaching out on not WhatsApp, Facebook and Insta and Twitter. It's very surreal. I honestly haven't, I still don't believe it. It's not something that I've processed yet. I think maybe 3 years from now it will make sense, but I don't think it's making sense right now.
Well, despite the heavy subject matter dealt with in that book, Scatterlings, Resoketswe Manenzhe remains a very light-hearted individual with a real fun approach to how she goes about her writing. Recommend that one too. Let's take you on an international tour now of a number of countries that Kate Mosse has pulled us along with in this book, her latest one in the quadrilogy that she's producing, The City of Tears. Now, you may remember the first book in the series. It was called Burning Chambers, and a fascinating read indeed. This, of course, is the second one, and there are 2 more to come. So I had a conversation with Kate, and I asked her about the series and where exactly it picks up from the last book.
It was very strange writing, The City of Tears, which, as you say, begins in 1572 with the decision about whether to go to Paris for the royal wedding, which will be between Marguerite de Valois, a Catholic, and Henry of Navarre, a Huguenot. And it is after 10 years of bitter religious civil war intended to bring peace to France. And it's been brokered by 2 queens, their mothers, Catherine de Medici and Jeanne d'Albret. And in June, before the wedding's supposed to take place in August, Jeanne d'Albret dies. And the allegation is that she has been poisoned by the Queen Mother, Catherine de' Medici. So it's an incredible moment of history. But when I was last in South Africa and in Johannesburg and Cape Town and Franschhoek, to launch the Burning Chambers itself, the beginning of the series of books, we were all watching on the television the royal wedding of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. And it was just so it's very strange to be writing this kind of thing while all of this terrible real history is going on around as well. So it was the logical place to start. What I do is I put my imagined characters in front of the real history, and the real history is as extraordinary as anything a novelist could make up.
Well, Kate, that's exactly what enchants me about the period in which you've chosen to set this, because I imagine as a writer of historical fiction, you can simply unfurl history's canvas and pick a period in which you want to set any series of novels. Why this particular period, though, against the backdrop of the wars of religion and more specifically the St. Bartholomew Days massacre?
Everything about my inspiration comes from landscape, and out of landscape comes the interest in the history and the mystery of a period. And that's where my ideas come from. And the whole of this series came from being in South Africa. And I was in Franschhoek at the literary festival, wonderful literary festival in 2010, a long time ago. And I had never been to Franschhoek before, even though I knew Cape Town and Johannesburg a bit. And I was being driven into the town and I saw this sign at the side of the road that said Languedoc. And this blew my mind because, of course, that's the name of the region in southwest France where I partly live and where all my historical fiction are love letters to that part of France. And then, of course, everybody knows this. Everybody in South Africa knows this. You get closer and closer to the town and all of the wineries have French names. And I thought, this is extraordinary. And then, of course, you arrive in Franschhoek itself and the main street is Huguenot Street. So I went to the museum in between my events that I was doing and learned a piece of history that was brand new to me, which was that a handful of French Huguenot refugees who had taken refuge in Amsterdam after the wars of religion sailed to the Cape after the full ending of any religious toleration in 1688, and were in part the beginning of the South African wine industry. Not entirely, it was already there. And this I found extraordinary, the links between Languedoc, a wine growing region, and then other parts of the world, and then Franschhoek. But the key thing that made me want to start this story was standing in the graveyard in Franschhoek, which many of your listeners will probably know, and looking up at the Franschhoek Mountains and thinking, these look like the mountains of southwest France. And suddenly having this like finger down my spine, thinking, what if you were a woman standing here in the 19th century, 1862, which is when Franschhoek as a town really looks like the town we can see today. And you had grown up hearing from your mother and grandmother and her grandmother and great-great-grandmother, going back all the way to the beginning of the Wars of Religion in 1562, so 300 years earlier, telling you about this beautiful land your family was forced to flee for religious persecution and you've never seen, you could never go back. And then you found yourself on the other side of the world in Franschhoek and you thought, this looks like home.
So Kate, just explain that process to me, please, how you're soaking up all the information of that period in order to work it into the backdrop of your novel. And just tell me how you put aside those 21st century sensibilities as a novelist and completely immerse yourself in that period in which you're writing.
Well, I think that there are two types of research that I do, and I divide them, in sort of simple way into two, into two, which is the book research, which is all about here. So it's being in the libraries, in the archives, reading every single book I can find on the subject, poring over maps, looking at old wills, going to art galleries and museums, looking at objects. So when you're in the museum, the Huguenot Memorial Museum in Franschhoek, you can see this tiny Bible that was smuggled out in a loaf of bread. So all of the all of these things, there are many objects, many bits of writing. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, which you've mentioned, which was the key turning point in the Wars of Religion. I could write the descriptions describing what the bride was wearing, Marguerite de Valois was wearing on the 18th of August, 1572, because she wrote her own memoirs. So I was using her own words to describe the dress she was wearing. So there's a huge amount available to research and find for that period. But then the other part of the research, which is the key part of research, is being in the place. And I think that historical novelists have to be we have to be detectives, and we have to be archaeologists. And it's about looking at the place that there is, you know, Franschhoek or Amsterdam, where a lot of the City of Tears is set, or of course Paris, and then shutting my eyes and imagining with the maps the city that would have been there then. And when you've done all of that, you are standing in the shoes of women and men of the 16th century. So historical fiction works best when it is completely in the time in which it's intended to be set. I cannot put 21st century views in the mouths of my 16th century characters. But when you've done all of your research, you are living then. And the one thing I would say is that the human heart doesn't change very much. Doesn't matter whether we're a man or a woman, what color we are, where we come from, what we live. If you hear the soldiers knocking at your door, their heart would leap like our hearts would leap. And that, I think, is why people love historical fiction, because we know that love and jealousy and fear and hate and jeopardy and passion and faith, these things are eternal emotions. And it's just a question of telling a story of real people that could have lived. And then our modern sensibilities just fade away. You know, we bring ourselves to the book, but at the same time, we are, you know, if I've done my job right, we are absolutely in the 16th century, hearing what they would hear.
Well, I think you've done a brilliant job of humanizing history in this novel, Kate.
Thank you.
I know this was originally meant to have been a trilogy. I'm not sure if it still is that, but I'm curious to know, how far is your next novel in this series in its conception?
Book 3, which is the one I'm working on at the moment, will start in Amsterdam, where my family and their enemies are still gathered. It will go to Tenerife in the Canary Islands, which was one of the great wine producing regions of the world in the 17th century. And at the end of book 3, my family will be arriving in the Cape of Good Hope on a ship called the Berg China that landed on the 4th of August in the Cape. And they will then, in book 4, be making their journey from Cape Town to Stellenbosch and to Franschhoek. And the 4 books each have an element attached. So the Burning Chambers was fire, the City of Tears, of course, is water. The 3rd book, because a lot of it's on the sea, is air. And of course, the 4th book, which is set all in South Africa, is earth, you know, the red earth that they find when they get there. So I know the end, because the prologue of the City of Tears is in that graveyard in 1862, and the descendants of my family and their descendants of their enemies finally come face to face. 300 years of a feud, they meet in that graveyard in Franschhoek, where the inspiration to the whole series came from. And I'm kind of now writing my way to there. So there's a lot of plotting, a lot of characters, a lot of, you know, missed opportunities, a lot of tragedy to come. But I can't wait to actually get to book 4 and finally be back in South Africa. And a lot of South African readers keep saying, you know, hurry up. We want you to get back to us now. So, you know, I will certainly be, all things being equal, be back in South Africa to launch book 3. And of course, book 4, we will do the global launch in South Africa as well, because obviously I owe these series of books to being in Franschhoek. That's where they came from.
I think we're all waiting for this COVID pandemic to be over so we can get going with the festivals and the book launches again. Wouldn't it be great to see some of those international authors like Kate Mosse back on our shores in no time? Well, that is where we leave it for today. I hope you've enjoyed the books that we reviewed for you and all the conversations we've had with the authors today. Remember, you can walk into any exclusive books and get hold of the 3 books I've been speaking to you about. You can also go onto their website if you prefer, www.exclusivebooks.co.za. Stand by in a couple of weeks' time. Eusebius McKaiser will have the next episode of Cover to Cover for you. Till then, happy reading. Take care.